Welcome back to part 2 of Lecture 10 on Progressive Presidencies. We left off with our previous lecture talking about the 1912 presidential contest and how Woodrow Wilson will be the beneficiary of the vote being split between not just the Democratic and Republican nominees, but also the Progressive nominee in 1912, which was former President Theodore Roosevelt. Also, another attraction for many voters was the fact that the Democratic Party, under Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom platform, was embracing a number of reforms. For instance, Wilson advocated lowering the protective tariff on many goods being imported into the country. He wanted a better banking system. He wanted to strengthen antitrust laws. Notably, however, we don't see any social justice reform. Some of that could have had to do with the fact that Woodrow Wilson was raised through most of his childhood in Georgia, and he was a byproduct of segregation-era politics. He was entirely unsympathetic, for example, to the drive to end segregation in the South. He even supported efforts by white Southerners in his cabinet to segregate government employees. He also routinely ignored pleas from the NAACP to pass some form of anti-lynching law to stop the torture and murder of black men across the nation. While Wilson was not interested in any sort of progressive reform when it came to ending the mistreatment of numerous minorities in the country at the time, he was interested in trying to reform the banking system here in the United States. He'll do this by helping to push through Congress the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This legislation was an attempt to try and shore up the American banking system. Specifically, you have a number of local and state level banks, privately owned banks, that in times of economic crisis would find that they would go under. And when these banks' doors would close, they would cut off people's access to their savings accounts. So you might have someone that had saved for decades and an economic crisis comes along, their local bank makes a series of bad investments and then suddenly just closes their door and you have no way to get your money back. So the Federal Reserve Act was aimed at trying to prop up or make sure, especially in times of economic crisis, to make sure that local banks did not go under. This would only worsen or deepen an economic crisis, obviously. So the Federal Reserve Act will establish 12 regional Federal Reserve banks under the control of the federal government. Private banks in these regions would then be required to deposit 6% of their assets into these reserve banks for the purpose of stabilizing the deposits of their customers. If then the economy took a downturn and a local bank was on the verge of closing, they could then apply to the local Federal Reserve Bank in their region. They could apply for that to get that 6% of their deposits, which had been kept safeguarded in the Federal Reserve Bank. They could apply to get that money back, and that might be just enough infusion of cash so that the bank could stay afloat long enough to guarantee the deposits of its customers. That result of this act was a substantial increase in governmental control of the banking industry in the United States. While the banking industry in the United States was not necessarily too pleased by this turn of events, we're going to see that Wilson will also come under fire for his foreign policy. While he tended to argue that Roosevelt's view that the United States should assume sort of a policeman role in the Western Hemisphere was not the right policy for America to pursue, that's not what his actions indicated. Wilson went back on his word, for instance, in 1913 when he sent U.S. Marines in to occupy the country of Nicaragua to stop an internal revolution in that country that would have threatened U.S. business owners. In other words, the same foreign policy that he decried, the Roosevelt corollary, he was acting upon as president. Wilson also sent U.S. Marines into the nation of Haiti in 1915 to protect, again, U.S. business interests there. And he justified his actions in these countries by asserting, quote, "I'm going to teach these South American republics to elect good men." At gunpoint, it would seem. Wilson's most serious involvement in Latin America came in Mexico during an internal revolution that first erupted in 1910. Fearing that all the upheaval going on south of our border might endanger U.S. citizens, Wilson sent U.S. Marines into Veracruz in 1913 to stop a shipment of arms to the rebel leader, General Huerta. However, all of these foreign policy entanglements would soon pale in comparison to the trouble brewing overseas in Europe during the period. The Great War had erupted on the continent in 1914, and for 2 years, President Wilson will do his best to keep the United States out of this global conflagration. In fact, the Democratic slogan for Wilson's re-election campaign bid in 1916 was, "He kept us out of the war." But several events will slowly draw the United States into this latest global conflagration. And when that happens, it will mark the end of the Progressive era.